It is a great pleasure to have with us tonight Todd Miller, celebrating the launch of his new book, Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders. It is, of course, published by City Lights Books, and it explores the concept of a borderless world, the idea that we may be better equipped to solve international problems and global emergencies that threaten our collective survival as a well-connected humanity rather than as a nation state or corporate fiefdom. Todd Miller has traveled the world talking with climate refugees, members of indigenous communities, border authorities, scholars, and visionaries. This has provoked him to reflect on the ways in which nation states create the very problems that drive immigration and how the abolition of borders could make the world a more sustainable and habitable place for all. Todd Miller has researched and written about border issues for more than 20 years. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Tom Dispatch, The Nation, San Francisco Chronicle, In These Times, Guernica, and many, many other media outlets. He's the author of 3 books that include Empire of Borders, The Expansion of the US Border Around the World, which was published by Verso Press. Also, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, which was published by City Lights, and which was awarded the 2018 Izzy Award for Excellence in Independent Journalism. And also, Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security, also published by City Lights. He is a contributing editor on border and immigration issues for the NACLA Report on the Americas and its column Border Wars. Todd will be joined tonight in conversation with Nick Estes. Nick Estes is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. In 2014, he co-founded the Red Nation, an indigenous resistance organization. From 2017 through to 2018, Professor Estes was the American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. He's the author of the book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. This was published by Verso Press in 2019. And with Jaskiran Dillon, he edited the volume Standing with Standing Rock, published by University of Minnesota in 2019. His research engages colonialism and global indigenous histories with a focus on decolonization, oral history, US imperialism, environmental justice, anti-capitalism, and the Oseta-Sakowin. Professor Estes is a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society, a network of indigenous writers. Really, it is such a delight and pleasure to have you both with us today. Todd Miller, Nick Estes, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, that was quite the introduction. I guess that turns to our portion, the Q&A. You know, we live in a world of profound inequality, and to my mind, nothing embodies that kind of, or symbolizes that kind of inequality more so than the border as we know it. The border is a concept, as an abstract thing, as a line on a map, but also something that structures our world and how we understand it. And this book, reading this book, I was reminded, you know, very much of the ways that we have borders in our minds, you know, borders in our hearts, borders in the way that we, you know, organize and think about the world. And you open this book with a scene in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, along the US-Mexico border. You meet a man named Juan Carlos, who says he's from Guatemala. He asks for water and you oblige, and he then asks for a ride, and you unwillingly hesitate. Giving this man a ride would constitute a crime. And it seems this hesitation is what structures the book. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why you begin this book with that particular scene and what kind of conversation unfolds from there.
Sure. Well, am I muted? No, I'm not muted. All right. Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question, and it's great. It's great to be here. That's a great place to start, because it really was that hesitation that it was actually quite a moment, because I was just before that moment, I was in the Babakiviri mountain range. For people that are familiar with Southern Arizona, and I was on the Tohono O'odham Nation, and had spent the night with an elder from the Tohono O'odham Nation right by the Babakiviri Peak, and from there you could see, you just see this beautiful landscape, right? From the top, you just see mountains, just like almost like waves in the sea. And there's nothing. If you're occasionally you can see a helicopter or something, but you look and you just don't see any evidence of this border, right? And there's no border. It's like looking into the world without borders, and it wasn't. I mean, what I was looking into was the ancestral and current land of the Tohono O'odham, where the border that as it's put did not exist, right? So I literally, from more there, I could look into Mexico and the mountain ranges into Mexico, and it's just quite an experience, looking and seeing things from that vantage point, and then descending into onto a dirt road outside of the mountain range, and going down, rumbling along, and then all of a sudden Juan Carlos, as you mentioned, Nick, came out. And this has happened to me before, and driving around, people come out from the side of the road, and I don't know, I don't know who, you can think, what's going on, but you really don't, right? I don't know what had been going on. It just seemed like Juan Carlos, he told me his name because he, as you said, he came up to the car, and I said, "Can I get you anything?" And he's like, I had some water. Do you want a bottle of water? And he just chugged the bottle just down in almost one gulp. And then, "Can I get you anything else?" And that's when he told me he's from Guatemala, and that he'd been in the desert for a few days. And he said, "Yeah, can I have a ride?" And like, why the hell wouldn't I give him a ride, right? Here I am, like, we're in a place where we're far away from anything. It's desolate. He's obviously really thirsty. He's probably hungry. He might be injured. Like, why wouldn't I would give somebody a ride in that situation anywhere, right? But there, I had to suddenly contemplate what was around me, and that meant that I had to realize that I was in the border zone, right? And the border zone is just in this area, and along much of the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, there's just border patrol everywhere. There's vehicles, there's scope trucks with high-tech cameras. There's predator bee drones that might be flying overhead. There's motion sensors that are, you can't even see, that you trip them and they send out signals, and some command and control center. Is there ground sweeping radar? It's like literally a war zone, right? And like a lot of this technology has been brought from U.S. wars and many different places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and just brought back and then deployed on the border. And so I have to think about that, and I have to think about the fact that if I give him a ride, Juan Carlos a ride, it's going to be a felony, right? A felony is to further someone's presence is a felony. You're given a smuggling charge, and then I would possibly face years in prison for giving somebody in need and trouble a ride. And it was that hesitation, right? The hesitation that lasted probably, just a little bit, but it seemed like an eternity. And that's the meditation that the book came with as a meditation from that moment, and from just like years and years of reporting on the border, and just really wanting to get down to the core of it.
The Sonoran Desert, for those of you that don't know, it is a life world for the Tohono O'odham people, as well as many, several different indigenous nations there. But as you just described, it's been turned into this death world. It's where people, it's a place where, migrants are kind of, channeled to go in there, and they understand, even helping, like there was a recent case with No Deaths Arizona, even helping or aiding people to survive is considered a crime, or you can be criminalized for it. And that's the kind of perversion of borders, as you write in this book. And you've been at this since the 90s. I think, I don't know, I don't want to like speak for you, but as far as what I've read, you've been at this since the 90s. And this book is, it's part reporter's notebook, as well as sort of a memoir. And it's not, I was trying to find like, what is the genre of this book? And, there isn't, really any one that really fits in my opinion, because it's kind of all of those things. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your thinking behind writing this book, and, how it came to be.
Yeah, it really, yeah, it really, the memoir, it's like part memoir, part essay, part like manifesto, really, in a lot of ways. But it does, like, in contrast to the other books that I've written, which have involved, and really more journalistic reporting, going to different places, interviewing tons of people, getting the reporting in these different places. This book was more of a kind of look, or I like this, I guess, meditation on almost 20 years of 20 or more. Actually, when you say the 1990s, my first journalistic endeavor was 1999, and it was snapping a picture of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers who were building the border wall. So, mind you, the border wall, 1999, not 2017 or 2018, in Douglas, Arizona, and yeah, so I just happened to take a picture of it. We went out we heard that they were out there building the border wall, and this border wall at that time was landing mat from the Vietnam War, that they were putting up, like a 15-foot high wall of landing mat. And so I got a picture. At the time, I really wasn't even a journalist. I was just some young punk roving around. But that picture got picked up by the Earth First Journal, actually, and that was my first publication. And then I think I write about this in Build Bridges, and then it goes from there, just even tracing the long history of how long the wall has been on the border, and how many administrations have been in power, right, in both Democrat and Republican, and just looking at that evolution of these different facets of border. Because, like, if you look at why they're building the wall in 1999, that's from Operation Safeguard, which is basically the prevention through deterrence strategy, which is the strategy that forces people to circumvent those areas and then end up in the desert, where I met Juan Carlos. So it's that very strategy of walls that forces people into these really desolate areas. And then watching the evolution of this thing, especially as these budgets grew in the post 9/11 era, and how counterterrorism became the priority mission of Customs and Border Protection and the creation of Department of Homeland Security, and then all this money pouring in into this border apparatus. Just if you look at the Clinton administration, it goes from like $1.5 billion to $4 billion by the end of his presidency in 2000, which is, at the time, it was like almost tripling of the border apparatus. But that was just the beginning. So under the Bill Clinton administration, you get the walls, like I just explained, but you also got 4,000, 5,000 new Border Patrol agents. I think by the end of the Clinton administration, there's 8,000 Border Patrol agents, going up for 4,000. You get all kinds of technologies, and wow, this thing is growing. And then that was just an appetizer, really, for what was about to happen post 9/11, and just the counterterrorism and the kind of the border as the global war on terror sort of aspect or framing. Just even though no so-called quote unquote terrorists came across that the U.S. government could define came across the border, the money just poured in. So just getting a firsthand, like watching this thing grow and grow, and the wall growing in the 2000s, and the Secure Fence Act that just built like 650 miles of wall, and the SBI Net. SBI Net is the Secure Border Initiative, which brought in the virtual wall and this idea of bringing in technologies to reinforce the physical wall, and the hiring of tons and tons of Border Patrol agents, and just watching all this unfold and reporting on it, and then eventually starting to really in-depthly report on it, and then in-depthly report on different facets of it, right? Like, oh, what does climate change have to do with it? What do people displaced due to climate, in Central America, for example? What does this have to do with that? And then discovering, well, this is actually, you look at you go into the DHS documents, and they're actually preparing for massive climate displacement in this way. And then looking at, oh, what is, like, how massive is this U.S. border? Because you could look at the southern border, but you start looking and it expands 100 miles inland, right? And then it expands even further than that, right? And it goes, and you see it on the northern border and along the coast, and then also expanding out into other countries and regions, and all of this like accumulates, and I began, you see, like, well, like right now you have a lot of talk about the border in a crisis, right? The border crisis. And it's ridiculous, right? Like the thing, like the border, like, I think, Nick, in your book, you write about, I believe there's one part in our history as a future that you write about the upside down world. Mm-hmm. Like the idea that the border is, you're writing about, I believe you're writing about Custer's last stand, right? And how it's, oh, the victim is Custer, right? And mm-hmm. and that's just, it's almost the same concept of the border. The border is like treated as this, it's the victim, it's in a crisis, right? The border's not in a crisis. The border is the crisis, right? It creates the crisis. It's a perpetual crisis, and it's just growing and growing, and you have this like massive apparatus. So you start, just to like end what I'm saying, you just really start to see, one, like, its absurdity, two, its brutality, three, its origins of, I think you mentioned this right at the beginning, like even how, in the way that, the way that the world is sliced up, the way we even think or can think, or even like who we can organize with, and what kind of barriers are put between us. And it's like, why do we go day by day accepting this thing? It's like the idea, like, of border security or like, always hear border security or protection. It's almost a rhetorical genius to always keep putting that out there. So you think, oh, it's securing, oh, it's protecting. And then you have to unpack it. It's like, what the hell is it protecting? What's it securing? It's not protecting, like the Tohono-O'odham, it's not protecting the Tohono-O'odham. Like every single person on the Tohono-O'odham Nation, for example, they've had problems of insecurity with the Border Patrol. It's not, the Customs and Border Protection, well, protecting what? Like, it forces people into the desert to be unprotected as possible. That's the nature of the strategy. So like, really, it becomes a meditation. That's a memoir, but it's not. In another way, it's just like, what is this? Why do we accept this? And isn't it now high time to really think about getting rid of it?
Yeah, and just to kind of plug the book for people, there's links in the chat that City Lights is posting. If you want to order a copy, you can find it in the chat. You touched on a lot of like really important things. One thing there's several things. First of all, my first experience with Border Patrol was I was with some friends. We were in Texas. We were in we were in Austin actually, and we were driving back and we went through a border patrol checkpoint, and everyone was indigenous. 3 of the people were from Navajo Nation, and we were going through the checkpoint. The guy, he rolled down the window, and he's like, "Are you U.S. citizens?" And the person who's driving, my friend, I'll just call him Andrew. He said no. He said yes, unfortunately. and he said, and then he's like, what is that supposed to mean? He's like, we're not citizens by choice. And the guy was like flustered, and he was like, oh, just get out of here. So we drove on, and we later got pulled over. The whole rigmarole thing with that. But we weren't even close. We weren't even close to the border at all. But that's it. It just kind of it was kind of integrated with this kind of like anti-indigenous racism. They're very obvious indigenous-looking people were in the vehicle. But then also I think it was last year, I was listening to the news one day, and they were saying this term BORTAC, and I was like, I've read Todd Miller's book. He wrote a whole book on this, and it was about how BORTAC was being deployed against the Portland protesters, and it like you had to explain like why that was, but also you talk very with a very expert tone about. This is the best way to understand the United States is actually like outside of the United States. And can you talk about that? Because that's kind of like that's almost like an upside down world as well, is because you are really writing a history of the United States. You're writing about it in the United States, or what claims to be the United States, but you're also talking about the U.S. as it exists in the rest of the world, specifically through border security. Can you talk a little bit about that, and like how that really kind of is a through line, not just in this book, but in all of your work?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. It really, I find that like seeing the United States, like looking at it as if being outside of the United States, as really as a fundamental lens that I look through in my journalism. I do have one little story I want to share based on your story in the coming from Austin with the Border Patrol. There's Ophelia Rivas. Maybe some people have heard of her. She's a Tohono elder, and she was. There's this great story that she's along the border, and she's actually with a group of college students, and they're just right by the border. I think they're near the border wall or the vehicle barriers, as in the Tohono Nation. And a Border Patrol agent comes up and pulls over, and the Border Patrol agent doesn't even really talk to them at first. They just kind of stands there, he's on his walkie-talkie and starts talking in this code language, and then he looks at Ophelia and says, "What are you doing here?" And then Ophelia starts talking to him in Tohono, and he just starts getting. He would answer her in English, and then she kept just responding in Tohono until he finally just became so flustered, and then she just said, then she talked to him in English. She said, you're talking to me in your language, like the code language. Yeah, so I think she does that a lot. That's the only time I heard that particular, I think she does that quite regularly. But the idea, like, I have some of the things that really inform this book is that I lived in Mexico for many years, in particularly Oaxaca, Mexico, and but also really traveled extensively. And the first time I lived in Mexico, it was it was a really kind of transformative experience for me, but not only in the sense of just being in Mexico and learning Spanish and all, learning about Mexican history and current affairs and all that, but also the thing that really dawned on me was like I could no longer, just talking to different people, hearing about their experiences with the border, I was seeing my country from outside of its borders, right? Like that's almost one of the most powerful perspectives I gained, I think, from that experience. And once that happened, then as some would say, a permanent derangement, or no, I just couldn't, like, I just couldn't see the world in the same way anymore. And this happened, or years, like 2 decades ago, and so I really credit those years, and not only living in Mexico, of course, all the different people that I met in Mexico, all the experiences I had going and for example, spending time with the Zapatistas and in Chiapas in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Those sorts of experiences really just kind of formed like the way, really a lot of the ways I look at the world, and really frames the journalism that really was flowing out of me in this particular book. In fact, I do go like into some of those stories, like going being in Zapatista territory and putting the border apparatus in conversation with what the Zapatistas are doing there, and just seeing like how the kind of movements, the movements, the going for really basic like democracy, liberty, justicia, democracia, libertad, and but also just basic human elements of human rights, but also, and this is something I think you do so well, Nick, and in your book, is like it's that, but it's also like this vision, the cosmovision, that it's not just like we're trying to fight the state for this stuff. It's like a vision of the world that's so much more it's so much more appropriate for the mess that we're in as a globe right now, right? And I mean, it's, when you think of the Zapatistas, they're talking about their what's going on there, of course, but applying it to a more global sense, and applying it to a world of relationships and solidarities, and what seems to be the direction we need to go to in right now.
You quote Ruthie in the book, where she famously says, you quote Ruthie Gilmore, the kind of preeminent abolitionist of our era, where she says abolition is about presence, right? Not necessarily just about absence. And you kind of pointed to it a little bit in how you ended that question or that answer. But abolition, also isn't about abandonment or, the lack of accountability, right? I would say, in fact, it's in some ways the kind of the fulfillment of justice, justice that, you can't get just by putting people in cages. But, you kind of started touching on it. So what, you touch on it at the end of the book a little bit, but so what proliferates in the absence of this border regime, or this border industrial complex, as you call it?
Yeah, I think when with Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, what the presence and the point that she makes, especially around prisons, that what is the problem that the prisons are a solution for, and so when she's talking about prisons, often she'll say, well, it is about tearing down the prisons, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also about looking at the conditions that make them the solution, right? And the same, I tried to like bring that idea of abolition to the border, to looking at the border apparatus, and what happens when you apply that? What are the conditions that make the border the solution, right? Like, is the border, right? You start looking at the conditions, and then you think, oh, okay. In Central America, like, to use one example of many, Central America, the United States has had the severe military presence in Central America. It's funded dictatorships, it's sent weapons, it's trained armies. That was a problem, right? Like in Guatemala, for example, where the army, the 200,000 people were killed in the oppression of what they call the Civil War that ended in 1996, which wasn't too long ago, or you can look, and that applies to El Salvador and Nicaragua and ways Honduras too. You could look at the economic models, and you think, okay, why were people why are people struggling to make ends meet? And you start looking at why has the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that in all these different countries, why is the structural adjustment happening? When you start looking at the conditions and what are the causes of the conditions, all of a sudden the place where we're from, the United States, we're looking in the mirror, right? Mm-hmm. These are coming, our policies are drastically influencing what's happening in different places. You look at climate change. So if you look at the United States, it's 700 times more greenhouse gas emissions since 1900 than El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala combined. So so this polluting of the atmosphere, and for example, those hurricanes that hit the coasts of Nicaragua and Honduras at the end of last year, that went from Category 1 to Category 4 because of the warmer Caribbean waters, and just blasted in. And then you have the 8,000 person caravan coming out of Honduras in January, and a lot of those people are saying we were displaced due to this hurricane. I mean, precarity probably due to the situation before the hurricane, but then blasted by this hurricane. And I remember reading one article. They interviewed a woman who was living under a bridge with her kids for months, and she was in the caravan. So what you start looking at the conditions, and all of a sudden the solution, you realize the solution is not this border. The thing that needs to be addressed is something completely different. And by it being addressed, does that mean what does that mean, right? That, for example, if there's the climate change, if the United States is putting in 700 times more greenhouse gas emissions, well, then that's one thing that could be addressed instead of, and that's an existential threat for the planet, right? And then the other thing is some people say, well, then send economic aid or something like that, and that is, if you know the history of economic aid, then you're like, well, wait a second, where does that go to? Because there is a lot of aid going to Central America. It goes to the security forces and border patrols that they're forming in the military. And there's economic aid, and it goes to neoliberal programs, corporations, and so maybe the true thing is to get out of there and let people people, if they, if people weren't having under the stranglehold, then people maybe, there could be, then new worlds could bloom. New worlds are already blooming, but it's against this struggle, and it's against this massive apparatus. Going for one last thing, if you look at it from a global perspective, if you look around the world and the amount of border walls and border apparatus and how much the United States plays a part of it, mm-hmm. It's really a scaffolding that keeps a business as usual in place. It keeps to simplify it maybe, but the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, right? And if it goes along with the 800 U.S. military bases around the world, and but if people want to move from Honduras, where they're going to hit all these people will be kept in their place. Only the people that can get past it. And so in a way, when you frame it in this other way, that it just becomes this is a scaffolding for the status quo, mm-hmm. and it's time to and bust out of it.
Yeah, I think climate change is a really good topic too, because it really dovetails with the pandemic. And now, we have what is called vaccine nationalism. People, I think the global north, especially the United States, is doing massive, vaccinations, which is good, for people who live here. But is also using, property rights to basically prevent the rest of the world, or intellectual property rights to prevent the rest of the world from developing or even getting their own vaccines. It is really reflective of, the way that climate change plays out. And I was just thinking about, as you were talking, Joe Biden is calling for a UN leadership meeting, a summit or a leadership summit on Earth Day, April 22nd. And traditionally, since at least 2009, Bolivia has used that, that day as, I think they called it the rights of Mother Earth. And after the coup in 2019 and Anya's, was put into power, she kind of backed out. And so now Biden is like, he took that kind of space that was normally allocated to Bolivia to kind of do their Earth Day thing. And now he's taking up that space, and he's, we need to reassert American leadership in climate change. And I'm just sitting there thinking about, like, okay, so we had the war on drugs. I mean, you mentioned this in the book. You have war on drugs, war on terror, and now we're entering the war on climate, which dating back to at least 2013, the so-called US intelligence community has labeled climate refugees as threat multipliers, people who will come and destabilize the United States or who may be crossing borders. And so you have to, US militarism becomes, the solution. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
You make that very, very clear. But then, there's also this other element to this equation that I also think that you make very clear. You talk about profitability and the border industrial complex. And you go to these border security conferences where people are like selling their wares, and you live in a state that is perhaps arguably one of the most securitized places on the planet. Arizona, a place where racial regimes, settler colonialism, US imperialism all converge. And you also make it very clear that borders don't just like exist to oppress people. They're deeply integrated into global capitalism and empire building. Can you reflect on that a little bit? Like how there is this, you talked about this massive buildup of this state machinery that goes beyond, Department of Homeland Security is supposed to protect the homeland, but the homeland now is everywhere, apparently. But then on top of that, you have all these defense contractors who are just raking in billions of dollars from this new security apparatus.
That's true. And more and more all the time. It's just phenomenal just to see how, for example, just to throw out a stat, in the last 12 years, if you look at Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the contracts they've doled out, I believe it's 105,000 contracts worth $55 billion. And this is from USA Gov, which notoriously undercounts, so it's probably even more than that. But if you look at that the 55 billion to private companies, the companies that as you mentioned, a lot of my research, I end up going into these border security expos and these conventions that are homeland security conventions that are just amazing. Like every time I go to these places, it's almost like you walk into some sort of science fiction cathedral, that's simultaneously a crystal ball into what's being imagined in the future for these borders, right? Like they're always in convention centers. There's always a lot of vendors from different companies. There's always a lot of Homeland Security officials, and there's always like red carpet floors, and then you see just drones and these high-tech cameras and aerostats. Aerostats are like surveillance balloons hanging from the rafters, and big like banners saying Raytheon or Elbit Systems or different companies like that. You see the biometric technology, which is really, in a lot of ways, that's the way it's going. And in the kind of border enforcement, the digitization, I guess, is that even a word? I used that word the other day, and digitization. Fine.
It is now.
Digitization of the border, like the biometrics, like the those concepts that like George Orwell was writing about, right? These database, like if you look at the DHS biometric database, it's gone from, I can't remember the exact numbers but from like 1 million in 9/11, and then as you said, when the American homeland became the planet, as the 9/11 Commission report put it, then this biometric system now has millions of people. I think it's like 15 or 20 million. So that thing is growing and growing, so this idea of like tracking people and surveilling people, and they're trying to build drones right now equipped with facial recognition technology, drones that they're testing them out, drones that are silent, they can come and take your picture without you knowing, and then fading away, and then that goes in the database, and then they can, track people. This whole idea of tracking, monitoring, surveilling is a huge part of it. It's like the panopticon as well, the Foucault's panopticon, the idea that there's so much out there, and you're not sure if you're being watched or not, but you always assume that you are because there's so much out there, even though in a lot of cases I think their technology is not as great as you think it is. Sometimes I run in a border patrol and they'll say, oh yeah, we'll radio to the other person, and you run into another border patrol and nobody told them anything, but anyhow, this whole idea of this technological fortress that is not only on the US border but growing around the world, that has a privatization, private corporation element to it, and a government element to it, and the separate individual countries, but also this countries coming together to harmonize. They're calling it the harmonization of these borders. So in a way, then you start to look at it and go, wait a second, what do you mean by that? And then it's like, oh, the United States is cooperating with Mexico, and so what is the border then? Is it like Mexico and the United States are cooperating, the governments, but the people are pit against each other, and the people have to face these borders, but the Mexican government's going to put up these borders. Or the Five Eyes. This is the United States, the UK, Australia. Those countries, right, have come together and have decided to harmonize their border systems. So you're looking at like the European Union, like the countries that have just perpetuated, they're responsible for colonizing the world, right? Mm-hmm. And then are the same ones that are coming together to harmonize their borders. And then you start to see, oh, it's not between sovereign nations, right? Like we're told, oh, when you hear Customs and Border Protection, oh, that's to protect us, right? This union of people. It's really not, right? It's really like a coordination of the elite from all different around the world, creating something and pitting up against the people from below, really. And that's like one of the big things that has become my understanding by doing all this reporting, especially, as the understanding of what this apparatus is, how it's expanding, how there's a profit motive to it. And all you have to do is also look at the border, like the forecasts for border markets are always, oh, this is a growing market. It's going to expand by 2025. We're going to have the biometric market is going to be this high, the Homeland Security market this high. It's when you go to these conferences, what's being talked about is how it's growing, how it's getting more pervasive, how it's growing into different places around the world, and then what's not talked about is how it's just making it harder and harder, as like for somebody from Honduras, like the example is the 8,000 people that came across the Honduran border into Guatemala and faced off against troops, U.S. trained Guatemalan troops and police that blockaded them and then deported them back to Honduras.
Yeah, very iconic imagery there. Like you have like a police line just basically trying to push back a mass of humanity. Real quickly, if you want to order the book, the links are in the chat feature on Zoom. So just a reminder that that's there. I have, when you were talking about this kind of massive buildup and the allocation of resources, and you don't explicitly say it, but I feel like there's a lot of, you're drawing a lot from the spirit of, the movement for Black lives with the reinvest and divest strategy, where it's like the border security apparatus, much like the military and the police, have accumulated so much social wealth, not just from the United States, but there's like, an imperialist relation like throughout the world, that those resources could actually be used to meet human needs, right? To give people homes so that they can to give people homes, to give them the necessary resources that they can use to mitigate climate change in whatever way they feel necessary. The right to stay, the right to move, the right to return. I think those are three categories. I can't remember which organization said it first, but I got it from AROC, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center in the Bay Area. But you talk about manifest dismantling of something called manifest destiny. And I don't know if everyone is familiar with that, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the role that manifest destiny plays in the securitization of the United States, of the homelands and its colonies and territories, and what you mean by something like manifest dismantling.
Sure. Yeah. So manifest destiny, of course, like the idea that the United States and its current shape of it that it's in is that, you almost sometimes you get this idea, oh, it's always been this way, and like, no, right? Like the United States shape that it's in came through tremendous violence, as you write about so well, Nick, and the manifest destiny, this idea that that European white civilization knows best how to civilize, and God is on their side, right? And so in the book, there's this painting drawn of manifest destiny that has this Greek deity who's like moving over the planet, as not the planet, what would be the United States, and just tramples the people that are living there, the environment, the living earth that's and so the idea of manifest dismantling, which is a term I got from Jenny Odell, the author Jenny Odell, and her book How to Do Nothing. She writes a lot about manifest dismantling, like what, for example, why don't we take the components or the mechanisms of manifest destiny and how they are now, like a dam. She uses the example of a dam. Take it out and then let everything rewild. And you could look at that for the border wall, right? Now we have 771 miles. I saw 701 miles. Not sure how many miles, but over 700 miles. And what about, like, why couldn't you just take it down? Like, right, I was in Sasabe, right on the border the other day, and I saw that they had taken down what I will call the Biden wall, because Senator Biden in 2006 actually voted for the wall in the Secure Fence Act. It's really not the Biden wall. He just voted for it, but it's a wall that had bipartisan support that was built along the U.S.-Mexico border. They tore that down, but instead it was to build the Trump wall, which is, instead of 15 feet, is 30 feet. And then what the Trump wall, you're talking about $20 million per mile or something like that, and you start looking at that idea of manifest dismantling in the border sense, and you're like, why not? Why, it's not only putting up the wall, it's the maintenance of the wall, but the wall is only one part of it. They talk about smart walls, so all the technology. It's so much money that's being spent in this now. So just to look at it from that perspective, and if you just took it away, like this This year, the budget was $25 billion for CBP and ICE. Last year, it was about 25 billion too. The year before, it was 23 billion. The year before, it was 21 billion. The year before, it's 20 billion. It keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And you think about, like you were alluding to, right, or just saying right at the very beginning of the question, you think about the real needs that people have, the real needs that people have on this planet. You think about like people in, for example, Flint, Michigan, kids drinking like leaded water or poisoned water, one place of many in the United States. Like, why? That's a security issue, right? Like if you're going to use that terminology, like we're constantly security issue, but aren't like kids drinking leaded water? Isn't that a security issue? Or like people, like in 2008 when you had the foreclosure crisis and people are losing their homes left and right. That was also the year that Border Patrol was in a hiring surge. 6,000 agents were being hired. And it's like, what is going on here? Like, what, if you think about security, then wouldn't a roof over your head or a place to go at night or a place to cook your food or something like that be a cornerstone of security? So just like looking at what people's real needs are, what, or even, you could even look at, oh, why are students like having, like students have to have such high student loans? Why can't that $25 billion go to that? And so students don't have to be in precarious positions coming out of, college. What are the many hundred, like thousands of things that we could think of that would help our human well-being more than building these border walls, more than putting these billions of dollars into this? And they're infinite. And then you think of, as you say, climate change, and you have this, like, why are so much, you have all these resources being put into this sort of thing and not into the interconnectedness that is needed to, on a global sense, the solidarity, the relationships that you have with other people, the ability to organize across borders. Like why in Sonora do we have to like struggle to organize with people in Sonora and Arizona? And why do Tohono O'odham have to struggle organizing with Tohono O'odham across the border? Or why do the Maasai in southern Kenya have to struggle to organize with the Maasai in Tanzania because of these borders and how they're put? So the idea of them is more to keep, it's like the problems that need to be solved are not being solved, and instead a lot of emphasis is being put on this. And it seems like by shifting it, then you start maybe to begin to create a world that really begins to start addressing the real problems. And you could even say the security problems that we have. I hate to use that term actually, but I'll just say it, like the security problems that people have.
Yeah, and there's an element to even the border security regimes that do exist, because they're very gendered. The people that they employ tend to be men. I'm assuming. This is just based on my own personal experience going through, having seen them. But you do interview, people from, the Border Patrol, and you do talk to them, and there is, from what I gather from just based on the conversations that you had with them, it's almost like the military in some ways, where it's like this is the way that you enact a sort of martial citizenship, by participating in this very violent system, and that's something that it's really difficult to really get at, I guess. Like, I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, like what those conversations are like, because you're living in, I'm assuming you're calling from Tucson right now, but that whole region is just rife with that kind of employment. I mean, here in there's a saying here in New Mexico. I don't know how true it is, but it's like you have two options. You either, as a young man of color, you either become a security guard at the prison, or you work for Border Patrol, meaning you become a cop in some sense, or you work in the oil fields. Like, those are the options for people.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back to the Great Recession in 2008, and the Border Patrol was doing recruitment. They were actually going around to different places hit hard by the recession. So they had something called the Buckeye Blitz. So they went to Ohio with the Buckeye Blitz, and they went to places, neighborhoods that were really hit hard and tried to recruit. They had a one in Florida called the Sunshine Blitz. Same thing. They went to like historic Black colleges and did recruiting there. They were, I mean, this idea like of recruiting and this mass recruiting in places where people had no other, like losing jobs. In my first book, Border Patrol Nation, I interviewed an agent who was working at Circuit City when Circuit City went under in like 2007, I think, or 2008. And then he said, he's from El Paso, and it's like, I only had one option, and that was his thinking at the time. And he was like a history major in school, but he said, my uncle was in the Border Patrol, so I joined the Border Patrol. And he ended up, his story is really interesting because he ended up, his mother's from Chihuahua, Mexico, and he would say like how proud he was of being from, his mom being from there and going there as a kid, and that actually got him fired from the Border Patrol. So that's why I interviewed him. He also expressed that he thought marijuana should be legalized, and he joined LEAP, which is the law enforcement against prohibition. And so and his story is very interesting, but it's just like in his case, it seems like in a lot of the cases of the agents, there are some gung-ho agents, and there's agents that are like, yeah, but a lot of the agents are just like agents that were looking for a job, and they got this job, and then for a lot of agents as well, it's a stepping stone to advance in law enforcement, federal law enforcement. The pay to start, you can make 70 grand with a high school diploma. So to some people, it's pretty enticing. And Bill Bridges, not Wells, I talk about one particular agent who's no longer in the Border Patrol, who left the Border Patrol, and there's this long story about, and this incredible story about how he was helping pull somebody out of a ravine, and I won't go into the details, but he ends up, while he's holding hands with the brother of the person, and there were 3 people that were crossing the border, or it seemed like they were, and the brother was in pretty dire situation. His eyes are rolling back, and he had bile coming out of his mouth. He was definitely in a situation where a lot of people find themselves crossing the border like almost dead, right? And but in his situation, he pulls them out, and he holds hands with the brother, and all of a sudden something happens, and he's looking down at the kid brother who's in the dire straits of the caring, and he forgets who he is for a minute, and he suddenly feels like that's his brother. And there's this whole sequence until his walkie-talkie goes off, and he goes back to being a Border Patrol agent. I don't know if he didn't say that experience explicitly made him quit, but and I just said the end of the story. The end of the story is that he was really traumatized by this whole thing. And his supervisor, his Border Patrol supervisor, knew it, and the supervisor called him and told him, "Don't worry, they were drug mules, right?" And the way when I was interviewing him, he said, "What?" He goes, "What did I care?" He's that first, his emotion, even like years after, like, why do I care if they're drug mules, right? This idea of like, again, this kind of dehumanization that's implicit in becoming an agent, right? You have to dehumanize other people. And then he finishes the story by then describing like there's a waft of marijuana. So it turns out like they were carrying like 50-pound bags of marijuana, and he smells it coming up from his neighbor below him in Tucson. He lived in Tucson, And he's like, and he ends as like, this is just absurd. That's how he ended it. And that, I think that story is like, he's, of what people go into the Border Patrol, and you have to like conform to the system, and it either chews you up or you do. And then you end up being like, I mean, just by the nature of the structure of the system, you become this enforcer of this like very like good or bad, legal or illegal, innocent or criminal, sort of mentality, and you have to enforce those lines between those two things. And for a lot of agents, that becomes blurred, and even they end up not even staying in the force.
So one final question, but before I ask it, we will move into the Q&A. I just want to remind people that you can pick up the book, or you can order the book from the chat. There's been several links posted. So my final question is kind of like where we're at now, because I feel like there was a lot of rightful indignation around, especially in 2018, around the call for the abolition of ICE and perhaps DHS in general. It's probably the weirdest program it's probably the weirdest department that exists. I mean, there are other weird departments in the United States federal system, but that alone, like, it's almost as if the funding itself justifies its existence. As you point out, year after year, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But this year, the Biden administration appointed a Latino head of DHS, but then you also have liberals, or ostensibly liberal, pundits calling for Biden to actually finish the border wall. But then also the indignation around children in cages is continuing, or has been kind of glossed over as if, that these are more humane alternatives to child separation, right? And I feel in some ways it's like putting lipstick on a pig, no offense to pigs, but that's the way it feels to me. So I don't know if you could reflect a little bit on where you see the Biden administration going, and, what are the movements out there that are really kind of inspiring you? You talked a lot about the Zapatistas, but maybe are there some like within the kind of like, on the border itself, or, around the world, or even in the States, that really inspire kind of your thinking in this particular moment in the Biden administration?
Yeah. So I look at the Biden administration with kind of two perspectives. One is, like lipstick on a pig, like kind of this, and no offense to pigs too, but this idea, the Biden administration is interesting because it came out of the gates with all kinds of executive orders, and we're going to reverse the Trump policies. We're going to stop remain in Mexico, which keeps people, asylum seekers, on the other side of the border while they're waiting. We're going to bring reunite families that were separated during the Trump administration, and that sort of thing, which seems like really promising steps on one hand. And then at the same time, the bigger issues of this weird, like you say, Department of DHS, it's not challenged at all. Like they're like the idea, the abolish ICE that lasted, it was way too fleeting, right? And it's still there, of course. In a way it was, it's incredible that word along with ICE became so prominent for a while, and it really even got into the mouths of even prominent politicians. So, and creating and planting the seeds of those sorts of possibilities. And even like some were even going further and saying abolish DHS, right? Which is wow, But then you have a Biden administration coming in, which is doing none of that, and not even coming close. Like the bigger structures of DHS are not touched. They come in with budgets that are bigger than ever. the CBP and ICE, they're talking about reforms, but who knows if that's going to happen. There's a 100-day deportation moratorium that Joe Biden said that they're going to put in place that was struck down by a judge in Texas. And since then, it doesn't even seem that there's any sort of political will to even push forward on it. And that whole bigger issue of prevention through deterrence, the strategy that's been on the border, on the U.S. border for 25 years, and the Caribbean for even longer, that's not even there's not even talked about. Nobody even says, sure, Trump built like 400 miles of wall or replaced areas with wall. You would think that if you go back to manifest dismantling, like if the Biden campaign was saying, oh, we're against the wall, wouldn't one of the things be like, let's get rid of the wall that Trump built? But there's none of that. So the bigger structures that are in place, and I want to go back to the border and crisis, right, that we're hearing now. It's the border is not, it's what creates the crisis, and it creates a family separation crisis, a constant one. And this is like with the Trump administration, they're separating families right at the border. But the border itself and the immigration apparatus and the ICE detention centers, and it's all about family separation. You have family members being taken and put into prison, really, and then forcibly deported from their children, and that constantly happens. So many people coming up are trying to reunite with their family members, and that's just like business as usual DHS, and that's one of the things that's definitely happening with it seems, at least with the Biden administration. They talk about not one more foot of wall, which is again a promising assertion for sure. However, they say technology, they're going to focus on technology, and that's like, oh God, that's when you go back to these border conventions. That's exactly what the big companies want. And I actually worked on a report that crunched the campaign contributions to both the Trump and Biden administrations going campaigns in the 2020 election. And we were surprised to find that 3-to-1 of the border industry went to Biden over Trump. So perhaps anticipating this like idea of moving towards technology, the surveillance cameras, the drones, the facial recognition, the biometrics, all that stuff. So as it stands in a status quo, that's what we're going to see. I think, though, and I'm glad you mentioned the abolish ICE and the sorts of things that did percolate into the Democratic Party. They, like, yeah, Joe Biden voted as a senator for the Secure Fence Act in 2006, but in his campaign, whether it was rhetorical or not, I don't know. He became very anti-wall, right, and very, at least rhetorically pro-immigrant, and that seems to be like a stance that they have to have, and that even if they're going to continue with a kind of status quo, that stance may leave like a window, because it seems like if you're going to look at it from that perspective, I think like what has to happen to change is not going to happen from a Biden administration at all. Like, left alone, a sort of status quo will happen. But the room to pressure a Biden administration is immense, and it seems like perhaps now, like, abolish ICE might not go anywhere with Trump, but if you get something going now just as strong as it was in 2018, maybe it starts to really pressure. But I think where the hope lies is not at those levels. The hope lies at the grassroots levels. The hope lies at from the bottom up. That's where I think the change will be made. It's almost to the point where, like, will people just ignore, like, is it possible to, and this is something that I try to write about in Build Bridges, the idea that what if you just or this comes from a Ruthie Wilson Gilmore quote, if you want to think about abolition, if you want to think about the abolition of borders, just live if the borders can just go, like, if they don't even exist. I think those sorts of abolition movements that Ruthie is definitely a part of, and many others that have grown over many, many years, like Angela Davis, who's been one of the has spearheaded the prison abolitionist movement for decades, right? Remembers, like those first years that it was, people thought they were, just looked at them like they were nuts. There's the same thing with the border. Like, what are you talking about? You can't get rid of this. You need this. It's so ingrained, this border, and that it's going to take like a lot of just like movement, momentum. And there are people on the ground on both sides, all sides of a lot of borders. And this whole thing of militarized borders in the scheme of things, and I know that they've existed for a long time in many different ways, and there's all kinds of different forms of them. But this militarization of the international borders, whether it be in the United States or around the world, for example, if in 1989 there was 15 border walls when the Berlin Wall fell, now there's 70, 2/3 built post 9/11. So this is growing as a really recent development, and in that sense, it seems like there's a lot of, these militarized borders have not existed forever. They can be removed. And not only that, it's essential. So it seems like what's been happening, the things that are happening in Arizona, for example, around the Trump wall, the Quito Baquito springs that were being dried up to build the wall, and that's the autumn sacred spring, and so many people came together to converge, and to autumn sat in the buckets of the construction and tried to stop the machinery from moving. Those sorts of stories are becoming more and more prominent. Those sorts of stories are really, at the core. There's one hand of stopping it. On the other hand, there's this imagining something different. There has to be something different, something more. There's too many. Why are we concentrating this? It's time to come together in a more, without the divisions and the militarized divisions, and then solidarity, and in that perhaps new and more beautiful worlds can be created.
Yeah, I was thinking about Biden's commitment to electrify the federal fleet, which includes all these border patrol vehicles, their airplanes, their helicopters. So it's like now you're going to be policing people with less of a carbon footprint. And I mean, that's kind of the cynicism of a lot of these, these approaches. And I really appreciate that answer. We have time for a couple of questions. I have two questions that are similar, so I'm going to put them together, and then another question. First one is from Mary. She writes, or they write, I'm reminded of the burning down the border town excerpt from the Red Nation Rising book, where Nick, myself, and my co-authors, Melanie Yazzie, Jennifer Denadale, and David Correa, talk about how borders are everywhere. Mary writes, I lived on blocks from the so-called US-Canadian border, cutting through Haudenosaunee and Winronan lands, and witnessed the border patrol agents used to repress and oppress Black and Indigenous and poor folks in that area. I was wondering if you could talk about, I was wondering if you could talk a little about how you border violence or construction of particularly US border politics extends beyond the so-called US-Mexico border to do violence to colonized people and sovereign nations around the world, and how we can better shape our politics based on this. And this question goes kind of hand in hand with this question by Heidi Lee, who asks, would love to have Nick to explain how his political work and Todd's analysis in this book can be used to help the left more broadly develop anti-imperial political analysis, and how essential this is to educating others, since this analysis is not going to be promoted in the majority of US media outlets. Plenty of money for the system's needs, but not for actual human beings' living needs. So those are the two questions. So one is about how does this analysis go beyond just the US-Mexico border and talk about sovereign nations around the world and how we can shape our politics around that. And the second question is, how do we use this kind of book and work to develop a more kind of grounded anti-imperial political analysis?
Great. You can definitely chime in too, Nick. I'll start and say one of the things that comes, it's way beyond the US-Mexico border, and the US-Mexico border happens to be like one of the hot spots for it for sure, or if not like a place where it emanates from, but it's all over the place, everywhere, on the, as you were mentioning, on the Canadian border. One story that immediately comes to mind is when I was in southern Kenya in the Masai Mara, and I went to see the border of Tanzania, and I went and that border with Tanzania has nothing. If you go to the US-Mexico border, you go to the Tanzania border, there's nothing on the actual border. But when like the border itself was drawn, as in the continent of Africa, it was drawn through the Berlin Conference, right? The Berlin Conference was nobody from anywhere in Africa had any presence. It's all Europeans in 1883, and they divided Africa up and just put these lines everywhere. And this is England, this is France, this is and that's like, you look at what happened in Berlin Conference, it's really tidy in Africa, but that's pretty much how you look at the borders around the world, and the sacrosanct borders that you can never breach, right? And they have these real profound roots in colonialism in that sense. And so when you talk to like people there's no wall there. However, like I talked to a person whose mother was born in Tanzania and who's also a Maasai. They share the same, they have language, they're both Maasai, right? They're the kind of, the historical roots are really deep, yet they're divided by this boundary line. And he says, he calls it, even without anything, this is a colonial line, in the sand, so to speak, an egregious human rights violation. And then you go anywhere, like I've been to like so many borders around the world, and it's the same everywhere. I remember talking to a guy in Jordan who's who the border is close between Jordan and Syria, and I asked him, do you like that? And he's like, no, this is pretty much it. I was in Ramtha, right up near the border. No, he's like, no, like my grandmother, I can't go see my grandmother, right? So it's this, like the borders have been determined by like not the people that live there, and it's almost always dividing people that share communities, share languages, and share, and would be normally organizing together. And then you add the militarization of the border, and including the Canadian border, the U.S. Canadian border, and how like it just divides through, and that there's been just a massive since 9/11. The resources that have gone to the northern border, the amount of border patrol agents, the amount of kind of collaborations that border agents have with like state troopers and local police, and then that becomes a force multiplier, right, to use that term. And then you recreate the border apparatus, and then you have it in the northern U.S. boundary, international boundary, and you don't see it building walls necessarily, but then you see all kinds of interior enforcement and like I did reporting in a place where there was a lot of farm workers that went to pick apples in the apple harvest, and the New York State troopers, this was near Rochester, they would put police vehicles in front of a laundromat and then put a border patrol would hang out with them. So if they had somebody without a driver's license, they would like then transfer them to border patrol. And those, like the border, wherever you go now, they're not only international boundaries, they kind of ripple inland, ripple outward. They like the Mexico-Guatemala border, the Guatemala-Honduran border, the Dominican-Haitian border. Puerto Rico is now, a total homeland security. There's so much homeland security coming out of Puerto Rico and going around on the Caribbean, what the U.S. calls its third border. The U.S. Coast Guard have been sinking ships outside of Ecuador. So it's you have this, like, this thing is just spreading everywhere. There's just lines of division going everywhere, and I think that answers the first part. Nick? I think you probably could say some things about the second part that would probably be pretty good.
Yeah, so I guess my only addition would be thinking about how settler colonialism is so foundational to a lot of this. I mean, you talked at the beginning of this conversation about 1776, and we saw that flag flying on January 6th, and there's been several 1776 moments in this country, like 1776 itself. I would say the secession of the South in I can't remember the exact date, in the 1860s with the advent of the Civil War, and then of course more recently with the rise of like white nationalist militia, etc. But what's often like ignored in that conversation is the fact that the first iteration of 1776 was an explicit intention for imperialist expansion and annexation, right? Not only to annex and to incorporate indigenous territory, because that's what it is. Like, we don't think of imperialism, we don't think of settler colonialism as imperialism, but in fact it is. It's territorial acquisition, right? So it does that on one hand, but then also it does it to expand its institution of slavery or plantation slavery at the same time. And so at this, it was doing this, like, the United States was doing this kind of double move, where it was competing with what it figured as European, imperial powers over control over territory that it eventually wanted to incorporate. And, of course that, expanded to the globe. And so the key here is settler colonialism, and understanding that the United States is a settler colonial country that was built on imperialist expansion, right? And I think that, to me, is the thing that's always kind of denied or misunderstood, or it is purposely done. Like, we can talk about certain things, but we can't talk about that particular history. Like, it's seen as a fait accompli, like it's already done and happened, right? But in fact, the everyday kind of policing of indigenous people, there aren't border walls surrounding reservations necessarily, but there is a kind of form of social control that polices indigenous life off reservation. Either it erases it and says that it doesn't exist, so if you don't exist, you don't have claim to territory, or in places like Albuquerque where it's hyper visible, it has to be policed, right? And that actually works in tandem with the laws that were implemented in places like Arizona. Like, those laws, yes, they targeted people who spoke Spanish, but they also, in ethnicity, but they also targeted people who phenotypically looked indigenous as well, right? And so these are kind of like operative functions of that securitization, or the the policing of the internal as well as the external borders, and the way it relates to the U.S. imperialism. I think is if you read books like Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, or you read books like Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, you understand that territories are themselves racialized, and entire populations and people are themselves racialized, not because of just a psychological bias towards these people, but of actual material conditions that structure relations of countries like the United States or Europe, or places like Europe, to the rest of the world, right? And that manifests the way security and all the things that you were just talking about play into them. And I think I was thinking of The End of the Myth book by I just forgot his name.
Brandon.
Greg Grandin, where he talks about that kind of dialectic between the kind of frontier border as well as the kind of imperialist mindset of the founders, because you have the Monroe Doctrine actually comes before the idea of manifest destiny, right? Which is a really fascinating kind of thing. And I could get into more of that, but I don't want to take up too much time. And we have one final question from Zhao. They ask, although the nation state predates physical borders, should a political project that includes dissolving borders at the same time reimagine nationhood and sovereignty? And what would that look like in a post-COVID-19 world after so many nations closed their borders or further limited movement through borders due to the pandemic?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab, and you can go ahead too if you want. I mean, one of the things with COVID, if you think of COVID, it again, like there's this great cartoon of this general, and he was standing on a border wall, and he was with his minion, and he was looking out, and there's all these missiles going like pointed outward, and then the assistant was like looking up with the binoculars and watching the coronavirus like go over it. And I mean, that's kind of like this pandemic. It could, what the world, like you see the world reacted with these lock down the borders when it really seems to be there seems to be another message embedded with that, in that there needs to be the opposite, right? A sort of global solidarity, this reaching beyond borders, the solution. Like right now with the vaccines, it's a little silly to have, like you mentioned earlier, Nick, that the United States would have so much vaccinations, but the rest of the world is like, I just saw a stat that Arizona and the whole country of Mexico, Arizona had more vaccines doses given out than the whole country of Mexico, or something there similar. So those sorts of disparities, like how are you gonna, for a pandemic to be undermined, it seems like you have to be addressing it everywhere, and there has to be this kind of reaching across borders and the kind of solidarity. And it's like a prefacing like climate, the idea of what's going on with the climate catastrophe, and the same sort of, it's like a practice run with what could be coming with climate, in the sense that the borders really actually, the way they are as lines of visions, as ways of, like, instead of addressing climate change, you stop people from coming, but also the fact that people coming together and being able to work together in a global sense to begin to solve these major problems. It seems like that could be a lesson gleaned from COVID. A world, it would be the lesson that I would like to see gleaned. A world that you start seeing things beyond the myopia of these boundaries. Like there's a point in every day where I have to just turn off the U.S. media, because it's the same sort of, it seems like it's bounding off against the border walls itself, right? There's a myopia that doesn't consider so many things that are going on around the world, and maybe these sorts of things, the silver lining is, okay, it is time to rethink. It's time to understand that these systems are not working in the way, like the way that they say they are. There was like when the United States started the Title 42 thing, where the CDC announced that we were going to close the border with Canada and Mexico. On that same very day, like there was hardly a case of coronavirus in Mexico at the time, and a plane landed in Atlanta of people coming from a cruise ship. Entirely, every single person I think was affected with the coronavirus. They went into Atlanta airport and then dispersed around the country. So you're closing down the U.S. Mexico border, but allowing like people that were obviously infected coming from a cruise ship that was infected, and that's the kind of logic that's disseminated in this, and it just seems like there's another way to imagine this, and maybe there's more people and more people thinking that, but the idea of these nation states with their own interests that are, and the way that we're doing things now is not going to work. So it's high time to really start to think of how to just crash through these borders. And I can think of no better way than just forming solidarities and relationships on so many different levels. And just like Gilmore said, you know, if the border, treating the border as if the border can go.
Yeah, that's a really good place to end it. I'll just tell one anecdote. So I come from a place where South Dakota, there was no mask mandates. The governor didn't even, you know, it's suspected that her own grandmother died in a nursing home from COVID-19, but still refused to believe the science. And so the tribes, reservations were required for their benefit, but also for the benefit of the people that lived around them, to close their border. Not like they didn't close them, but they just set up health checkpoints for everyone's safety and the lack of any kind of precautions, right? And so people were making accusations, oh, you're just doing the very thing that you accuse us of doing. You're excluding white people from the reservation and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, it was a back and forth. The governor actually threatened to send in the military or the National Guard to break the blockade. And after the allocation of, you know, vaccines came about, the tribes themselves and their IHS clinics, Indian health clinics, when they would have extra vaccines and surplus vaccines, they would reach out to the surrounding, mostly white communities and say, hey, you know, you should, if you want to come get a vaccine, you should come get a vaccine. And that's the same that happened here in this state, you know. So this idea that it's ingrained, or it's the natural idea or it's naturalized to be against human solidarity or empathy, as you point out in the book, is actually, it flies in the face of the actual reality and how it's practiced, you know. And so we don't have any more time to get into that, but I think that was a good way to a good anecdote to kind of end that. And I'll turn it over to
I'm right here.
Oh yeah, okay. Turn it over to
This
Lights.
has been such a deep dive, and Nick Estes, thank you so much. You've been such a great interviewer. Todd, congratulations. It's such a pleasure to have you with us again in our orbit with this amazing book. Hope to see you all soon. Please be safe, be well.
Thank you.